It's been 12 years since the release of Ratchet Clank: A Crack in Time in 2009. You see, I was only 9 years old when I walked into the local EB Games and walked out with a new release in my favourite series. And ever since that release, looking back now at the years that followed A Crack in Time, I see an Insomniac Games that was just as aimless as I would turn out to be in those years. They would release competent, if not very inspiring titles with what seemed like a lack of conviction that really led to commercial success and even more really critical success. Sure, there was some decent stuff in there, but nothing like the quality that they released in the late 90s and 2000s. And to be honest, I don't blame them. Releasing a game every year for 7 years had probably drained the team of most of the creative passion that they already had. And it all culminated in Ratchet Clank for the PlayStation 4, a bland, lifeless husk of not only a once great series, but also a once great development studio. But times have changed. Insomniac has gotten back into their stride, and with the smash hit of Marvel's Spider-Man, it seems like Insomniac has finally gotten out of the rut that they've been stuck in for many, many years. And it was exciting to see one of my favourite development houses back in the game, but it was difficult for me to get excited over Spider-Man in the same way that so many others did, because he wasn't a part of my childhood in the same way he was for so many others. Not to say that they're wrong, not at all, but more that it had seemed, somewhat so, that Insomniac had moved on to bigger and better things, and that kind of bummed me out. It's why the announcement of a new, fully featured, full-length Ratchet Clank game for the PlayStation 5 had me excited enough to buy one of these great monoliths. Not because I thought it would be the greatest game ever, not because I was hyped out of my mind, but because, well, Ratchet Clank is my Spider-Man. It was a massive part of my childhood, and it led me into the interests that I have today. So seeing that a refreshed, excited Insomniac Games was taking another look at these guys, it intrigued me. And the more I saw of it, the more I was intrigued. It bore enough of a resemblance to 2016 for me to not get my hopes up too much, but there was enough there for me to believe that, on some plane of reality, it could be great. Consider this your spoiler warning. This isn't going to be a super analytical review. I'm going to go into the weeds a little too much, and I'll probably miss some stuff along the way, but now that I have played this game, I'd like to share what it means to me, both for good and for ill. That being said, if you know anything about Insomniac, you'll know that they're an animation powerhouse, and it really shows here. Not just in movement, but also in scene construction. The environments in this game are just fucking sublime. Everywhere in this game looks fucking fantastic, and I'm not even going to start to try and explain why. Just have a look. Every planet has this level of detail. They've clearly had many, many days poured into them from talented artists and programmers alike to create a rich atmosphere no matter where you are, and it really shows. Look, I'm not great at explaining visuals, and you all know that this looks fucking great, so let's get way too far into the tiny details and have a look at the UI. I actually quite like the UI of this game. It might be doing the simplified logos trend a little bit, but where it counts, it functions well. There's not really much to say about the ammo, health, and bolt UI elements. They fit and they look alright, but I really like the ammo count over the reticle. I actually noticed myself looking at the ammo count in the corner less because that bar is really all you need. You don't really need exact numbers for ammo during combat, and bolts and health you don't really look at that much, so you can spend more of your valuable seconds looking where you need to rather than at UI elements. The planet selector is a little weird. The visual of the planet shows it scrolling horizontally, but the menu itself and also the controls scroll vertically. You're probably going to try and scroll this on the wrong axis if you're anything like me. Some other very minor things. It took me an embarrassing amount of time to realize that the game menu was on the touchpad and not the options button, which the game only tells you when you've maxed out the quick select wheel. The options button is used for more traditional settings, audio and visuals and stuff, and the touchpad is used for more game specific stuff, maps and weapons weapons and whatnot. There is one thing I'm really not a fan of, it's the game save menu. There's only 5 slots and you can't move saves around to where you would like them. Not even by saving the game, because guess what, you can't fucking save the game. If a save is in a specific slot, it's stuck there forever and there's nothing you can do about it. But on the whole, I quite like the graphical elements of this game. It's a little bit too reliant on lists for groups that are too long for my tastes, but it does the job and it looks quite nice. So this game looks great, no one expected it not to, but as you can probably tell, I'm not much for explaining the details of why games look the way that they do. I mean, Digital Foundry exists for a reason, but there is something in there that makes me very happy. 60 frames per second. Here, let me just... After 12 years, we finally have another Ratchet game that runs at not dog shit frame rates, and I don't care who you are, but you should 100% change the quality from fidelity to either of the performance modes. Performance RT looks better with real-time ray tracing for its lighting, but it has a resolution target of 1440p. While normal performance has typical lighting and reflections, cube maps and screen space effects and whatnot, but has a 4K resolution target. For me, I'm running my PS5 into a 1440p display anyway, which for some reason accepts the PS5's 4K signal, so the extra resolution of performance is negligible, and to be honest, even the extra detail from fidelity mode is rarely even noticeable, and the only time I'd ever actually give a shit, photo mode, it's always enabled. I think. The frame rate drops, that's all I know. I assume it's putting you into fidelity mode, but it doesn't reset to the last checkpoint like changing the quality settings does. Speaking of this game's performance, fuck me does it load stupidly fast. There's no other way to put it. Everything from the level transitions to the title screen to gameplay time, everything is really fast. In fact, I'll show you exactly how fast the level can be loaded, and I guess also unloaded from memory. The second version of the level is never stored in memory when it's not in use. The game is just able to dump the previous assets and load the new assets that fucking quickly. It's fucking nuts. Even the planet flybys, which I thought like before were masking and loading, they just aren't. You can fucking skip them. You can't skip the ship exiting and arriving planet animations, but at the very least, a third of this time isn't actually being spent loading. And despite the fact that we barely register loading anymore, it's still very noticeable in the moment-to-moment gameplay. Want to go to another planet? You can be there in 5 seconds. It's just that little bit closer to breaking down the barrier between player and game. And even if you forget about it consciously, subconsciously you'll never forget its effects. Right, let me get that out of the way so we can talk about the game's music, which is actually not bad. Sure, some of it is quite generic, and the main theme, this motif here. It gets overused way too much. Once you recognize it, it gets kind of annoying, but on the whole, it's pretty good. Nefarious's motif is pretty good, and also the fact that the opening to his broadcast is just the opening from Smash 4, it's insane, it's stupid, but I fucking love it. I kind of wish that they'd taken some of the elements from the old game's soundtrack. I mean, we've got some returning planets here, but the most that I can find is Sargasso using a motif from Haven City in Jak 2, which is just... what? But disregarding that, right, just have a listen to Blizzard Prime straight off the soundtrack, at least before the horns kind of drown everything out. It's some great stuff. It's why when this music is being more ambient, it's excellent. You know I'm a sucker for ambience, and this stuff here is really fucking good. Which is more than enough to make me overlook the more generic action stuff, which actually can be pretty good as well, when it's not in full tilt action mode and in smaller encounters. Sure, it's never going to live up to the original quadrilogy, but at this point I don't think anything can, and what we have feels like a pretty great, if somewhat overused compromise. I just wish that you could hear it over the cacophony that makes up this game's sound mix.
We must get to the roof!
The Emperor demands you bow, and then goes black. It is the feng shui. You are just in the way!
The music priority in this mix should be way higher than it is. It gets drowned out by everything else. Especially dialogue. Man, people do not shut the fuck up in this game. I mean, granted, it's a lot better than we've had before. Like, I'd take this bantering with the enemies over the shit in 2016 any day of the week, but it's just overpowering. Music can be a great tool to aid combat rhythm. I mean, fuck, just look at Doom. And it's a shame that it can't be used like that in this game. I'd love to be hearing more of it. Luckily for me though, I can, because I can just adjust the audio mix myself, because oh my god, look at all these settings. There's been a trend in recent years of greatly improving options and accessibility, and I for one could not be happier. Sure, most of this crap I'd never use, like the objective highlighting and junk, but I'm not the one that this stuff is designed for. I've played many a game before, and I must say that I am very good at them. But many people haven't, and what to me is a fairly passable scene, to someone else who isn't an absolute fucking nerd, it probably just looks like white noise. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. If this helps you, you know it helps you, and what I'm more interested in is more generic settings. Performance mode, audio mix adjustments. Sure, it's not the swath of settings that I love about PC games. Yes, I like this shit, I'm a fucking weirdo, but it feels like a great compromise between settings that are understandable to people who don't know what the difference between MSAA and FXAA is, while still being powerful enough to have meaningful change. But it seems alongside the more PC-like settings, we've also brought along the more PC-like bugs as well. This game isn't, or at least wasn't, horribly broken, and it seems like they patched out most of everything I'm going to talk about right now, but this entire video is based on the game as it was the week of its release, so I'd just like to mention the shit that fucked up on me during my multiple playthroughs. A couple of times the game failed to load when trying to switch dimensions. It just soft-locked me in the white void. It also soft-locked me a couple of times in the vendor. One time it even hard crashed the PS5 itself when I tried to close the game, causing me to have to physically remove the power. There were maybe 3 or 4 crashes to the home screen, but probably the worst is that the final optional mission on Sargasso was bugged out on my save. When I completed it, I couldn't move, and it saves right before this, so the save file is fucked. Luckily, the PS5 has save history, so you can restore it to an earlier point, but if it didn't, this would have just bricked my save, and I'd have had to redo my entire challenge mode playthrough all over again. From what I know about releasing to Sony platforms, that's an A bug. The game shouldn't have been able to go gold with that still in it. But I'm kind of willing to overlook it in this case because, for one, the reason that I don't have footage of it is because it's already been patched out, and for two, from what I know about the development of this game, the reason that this stuff slipped through the cracks is because Insomniac Games didn't violate the human rights of its employees, which, as we all know, isn't exactly guaranteed in this industry. Okay, this game's presentation is good. Who'd have fucking guessed? Okay, maybe I shouldn't be that flippant about the presentation, but it almost certainly took an unimaginable amount of work, and, you know, I got some fun out of photo mode, I'm not gonna lie. But what really holds my interests, especially long term, isn't how a game looks. It's how it plays. The core of the game is, for the most part, reasonably satisfying, but we all expected that, and given how many times I've done it before, it's kind of the bare minimum. So what have they done here that's actually new, that's an evolution of the systems of games past? Well, there are several additions, but I'm going to start with the more minor stuff before I get into the more structural changes, which are mainly in combat. So let's have a look at the adaptive triggers. For those that haven't used a PS5 controller in a game that utilizes the adaptive triggers, the easiest way of describing them is a combination of the ability to vary the resistance of the trigger pull at specific points and trigger specific vibrations. And I know that the two are achieved with the same motor, but mechanically they act separately, so I'm going to treat them separately. The weapons that most easily quantify the trigger vibration are the automatic ones, the burst pistol, the lightning rod, etc., as when you fire, the trigger will vibrate at a frequency that matches the rate of fire of the weapon. Now, I don't know if that's actually analogous to how a fully automatic rifle feels. Living where I do, I haven't exactly fired one, but regardless, it feels really good. I do wish that the motor inside the triggers had a little bit more power, because it's easier than you'd think to suppress this feeling just by pressing really hard. It never goes away, but it's a lot less pronounced, and it also moves the vibration from the trigger and your finger into the entire controller, which makes it violently and loudly rattle. The other feature of the adaptive triggers is a little more complicated than just burning your fingers, because it has gameplay ramifications alongside the general feeling of playing. The ability for the controller to have set points in its pull that have more or less resistance means that it's much easier for the player to quantify whether or not they've pulled the trigger far enough to trigger specific actions, when the action varies based on the distance of the trigger pull. The Negatron Collider, for example, has a half pull to charge and then a full pull to fire, and because there is a point during your trigger pull which you can feel and also have to press harder than normal, that half pull becomes a lot more intuitive, and the designers can map controls more reliably to trigger half pulls because it's a million times easier for players to actually do this. It's also just a nice sensation when there's a little bit more resistance to your pull, as once you pass through the point of extra resistance, it goes away. It has a sense of breaking or giving. It's quite satisfying. It's not strong enough to make it too difficult to pull the triggers as well, at least for my hands, but it is strong enough, if you're holding it in the right place, to push the trigger back up a little bit. The effect is most noticeable when reloading the Headhunter. It's just that little bit more information for you to use in combat. It's really great. But moving on, what about the non-combat gameplay? It tends to be where the designers can fuck around the most because they don't really have standards to maintain, so the alternate gameplay modes tend to be quite interesting. And in this game they're... right, let me explain. The Clank puzzles in this game are pretty good. They're not at the level of the recording puzzles in the Crack in Time for a number of reasons I'll get into later, but they're still pretty good in their own right. They involve leading a path of duplicate Clanks to the end of a path using a variety of different effects, like speeding them up, making them float, or making them fat. And they get used in some pretty interesting ways, puzzle design-wise, and there's really not that much to comment on. They're pretty good puzzles, more challenging than I would have expected, but not as much as I would have liked, if you catch my drift. But then there's the icky thing of how they get integrated into the game itself. It's not the most cohesive pairing of gameplay styles. You kind of just get dumped into a completely different game, in a different world with different characters and different gameplay. And they don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Apparently they're supposed to show Clank how to fix the dimensions, but we never see him do that. We're just told that somehow this is just making him know. It quite honestly feels kind of lazy. And this is where I'm going to bring up the great clock puzzles in the Crack in Time, because I feel that they're a much better use of Clank, partly because they feel congruent to the main experience. The Great Clock is a place that Ratchet will eventually walk through, and the puzzles that you do are properly integrated into the game's fiction. That isn't just teleporting you into the fucking cyber realm. Oh, and also, fixing the time anomalies will actually remove them when you travel to those planets as Ratchet. It's a really nice detail and actually a gold ball puzzle, and it works to tie these two gameplay modes together. These dimensional puzzles don't attempt anything similar. Oh, and I also fucking hate that this guy is the son of the plumber. That's fucking stupid. The only redeeming thing about this guy is that he insinuates that Rivet and Clank could fuck each other. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe that's not a good thing. But if you can ignore the whack shit, and despite what I've just said, I kinda can, they are some pretty well-designed puzzles. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same about the other alternate gameplay mode. Look, I'm not going to be kind to the glitch challenges because of all the gameplay in this game, they feel by far the least considered. There are only about 4 or 5 of them in the entire game. They each last about 2 minutes apiece, and they've got really simple and bland base mechanics. It's pretty much just strafe and shoot another thing X number of times. And whoever decided that she shouldn't be able to interact with Ratchet, shame on you. I might have been a lot more kind on these if they actually felt like they fucking mattered. As they are, they're so incredibly separated from the rest of the game that it honestly feels like an entirely separate experience, not an addition to the game that they've been grafted onto. It's even worse than the Clank stuff, because at least that was fundamentally decently designed. This doesn't have anything to fall back on. Only half of them are even necessary to beat the fucking game. The other ones are just for gold bolts, and I'm just so confused as to why they're even here. What's the point? Did they have uni interns that they needed to dump onto inconsequential projects? Because that's what it feels like. Just real boring, and in stark contrast to the much, much better design of the rest of the game. So let's get out of this shit and talk about some fucking combat. Right, let's have a look at what they've added to the combat that evolves it past what has come before. Because anything that they've already done feels pretty much the same as they've done before. The fundamentals really haven't been altered. The enemy design, weapon types, and controls feel straight out of 2016. But what they have added is 2 new mechanics, an updated traversal mechanic, and a change in arena design that all forms to create a combat experience that favors something that I would have never expected: movement. For reference, the 2 new mechanics are the Phantom Dash, which allows you to hop short distances while becoming invulnerable, and the Rift Tethering, which allows you to teleport to specific locations in a given arena. These 2 new mechanics don't change the combat as much as you'd probably think. The Phantom Dash is probably the most impactful of the 2, altering the way that you move slightly, and the Rift Tethering makes positioning feel slightly more directed than I'd like, because it's the designers dictating where they go, rather than the player. The best use of the Rift Tethers is when they're on opposite ends of the arena, because then they act as ways to quickly switch the direction of combat, rather than teleport to the advantageous spot now buttons. But really, the mechanic that drives the design of the combat the most isn't even a combat mechanic, it's a traversal one. It's what they've done to the hover boots. Now, for those who have played the game, I'm not talking about the mechanic where you have to pump the hover boots to max speed, because that matters so little that I turned on hover boot auto pump on all playthroughs that weren't my first, and 20 seconds later I forgot that that wasn't even a mechanic in the first place. But that speed, fuck me that speed. It's fucking broken in a way that I never expected a AAA game in 2021 to be, because you get some fucking distance with the hover boots. In Up Your Arsenal and Going Commando, I promise this is relevant, there is a movement technique called neutral long jumps, and it stems from a wider movement concept of neutrals. Essentially, if you cancel the charge boots by firing a weapon that doesn't kill your momentum, alongside the press of the button that sends you into first person mode, assuming that your left stick is in the neutral position, hence neutrals, you'll be put into a state where you can perform actions using the momentum of the charge boots that you normally couldn't. The game normally waits for your momentum to dissipate before allowing you to perform those actions, but by tricking the game with the first person reset, you can do shit like long jumps straight out of the charge boots. That's the neutral long jump, which allows you to long jump about 5 times further than you would normally. Now, why the fuck am I talking about this? Well, because that move is a major part in sequence breaking multiple planets. It can break the game in a variety of ways. It's really fun, and just jumping with these new hover boots makes it seem shit in comparison. Now, before all you Ouya speedrunners get mad at me, yes, I am aware that the movement tech in those games breaks them because it wasn't designed around them. And theoretically, the movement in this game isn't nearly as cool to play around with because the designers explicitly know that you can do it, and hence can design level geometry around your immense speed. And to an extent they have, but it feels like they just didn't quite tighten everything up if they didn't want you to complete things in ways that they didn't intend, and I fucking love it. There are so many places that even on my first playthrough I was able to bypass with just the hover boots. No speed tech, just the mechanics as they are presented to every player. AAA design has been so focused on gimping your movement to half-baked contextual actions in order to stop players from breaking from the intended path, that the ability to play around with the movement to find creative solutions was actually surprising. Granted, there are more death planes than I'd like. Seriously, the designers, please stop this. It's fucking weird and shouldn't be your way of making sure players don't go where you want them. Don't give the players the tools to traverse these gaps and then design your levels to have these gaps if you don't want them to be able to fucking traverse them. Just design the level differently, for fuck's sakes. But really, that problem only happens on Blizzard Prime. The rest of the game is largely kill plan free. But let's get off this tangent and talk about how it affects the combat, because that's what we were actually talking about. Because yes, you always have access to the hover boots, they're full speed, and just how quickly you can get going means that traversing across arenas is real fast, and it means that your positioning can be much more fluid, especially in larger arenas. And the designers know this, because the arenas are designed in ways that encourage you to move. Like, I've never seen a slingshot target in a combat arena before, but here they are. Not only are the hover boots a lot faster than they used to be, but also their turning circle has been drastically improved, so during combat, you aren't punished if you whip them out because you aren't locked into mostly straight trajectories, which would make it easy for the enemies to hit you. It also feels like they've adjusted all of the movement to be a lot less committal. Essentially, you can cancel those into each other much faster than it felt like you could before. Not sure if that's actually true though. However, it means that performing a move doesn't lock you into that move for long enough to make using that move a big decision. Basically, your actions are less puzzle-like and more reactionary. The hover boots and the phantom dash can be used more when it's quick to immediately have normal combat movement after they complete, because they don't feel like they're breaking the flow of the combat, and that's definitely something I've never been able to say about them before. Except that they might have added some ending lag to the hover boots in one of the patches. I'm not sure, but I have a feeling that on the day 1 patch there was less time between finishing charging and being able to fire. I'm not sure why they would do that though, and I don't have any proof of it, so I don't know. It's this kind of design that makes combat and traversal, the two primary gameplay loops, feel connected in a way that they never really have before, because the tools from one help you in another. It's not a radical shift, but it's enough to make the combat in this game feel unique in some way. Granted, there isn't as much of a massive shift as I would have liked, given that not all of the returning mechanics support this combat style, and as I'll get into later, that's why I feel the game is more fun when it's less challenging, because more fun movement isn't discouraged as much. What you've been watching is my favorite combat arena in the game. Funnily enough, it's the penultimate one, and it's because of how much space you have to work with. And it isn't just throwing single bosses at you, which can tend on the more boring side of the combat, because it feels like they've been designed for you to move in specific ways, rather than to make you play with the movements. The weapon selection in this game it's almost great, and I just wish that they had taken the small steps that they needed to in order to make it truly amazing. So to get the bad out of the way first, there is some old reused stuff in here that just shouldn't be here. The Glyph of Doom is alright, but it seems unnecessary, and I wish they were just the Agents of Doom from Up Your Arsenal. Like, if you're just gonna shamelessly reuse a weapon concept, at least make it the cool version. At least it's actually an old weapon. Get the fucking Buzzblades out of here. They've been in 5 games now. The only thing that makes me not abolish this outright is the fact that they don't take up a main weapon archetype, like the blaster or the rocket launcher. New Bouncer sucks, but that's more just because the old Bouncer is better. It isn't actually that bad. I just wish for a Bouncer that actually feels like the Bouncer, because the new Bouncer design for 2016 feels pitiful in comparison. The actually truly terrible one is the fucking Peacekeeper. Why is it here? What the fuck, Insomniac? What is wrong with you? The same weapon with a different visual design and name was all you needed to do, but nope, we got this for the 5th fucking time. Like, come on guys, make a new fucking rocket launcher already. I know you can do it, you've done it before. You did the same thing for other weapon types in this fucking game. It's just a fucking rocket launcher, come on. Right, now that we've got that out of the way, we can talk about the rest of the weapons, because they're really, really fucking good. The weapons have been designed around the new adaptive triggers, like the Negatron Collider I mentioned before. So you've got stuff like the Burst Pistol, where instead of upgrading to the triple shot like the Combustor does, it upgrades to have its rapid fire be the triple shot, which is different from the slow burst, and they are activated with different pulls of the trigger. It's great stuff, and it means you don't lose the single shot when it upgrades, and they can also make the rapid fire less accurate to have each serve a different purpose. Stuff like the Scatter Bomb, the Enforcer, the Headhunter, they're all pretty much reskins of older weapon types that have been altered to benefit from the adaptive triggers in different ways. The Headhunter having slow-mo when aiming only with a full pull of the trigger, a half pull just pulls out the scope with no slowdown, while the Enforcer just seems to be designed to vibrate the controller as violently as possible. The actual function isn't that much different with the adaptive triggers, given how light the step is, and the Scatter Bomb has a very light press of the right trigger to enter aiming mode. It's a nice touch that reduces your need to press another trigger. The Topiary Sprinkler is a great crowd control weapon that is actually a new concept, and not just the Groovatron again, hooray in parentheses, and the Negatron Collider is just really sick. God, it sucks at higher difficulties, but fuck me do I love using it. The Void Repulsor, Ricochet and Drill Hound are all okay. Like, a shield in a game with this much movement isn't really that useful. The Ricochet isn't as useful as I'd have liked. It does more damage than you'd expect though. And the Drill Hound, while I like that it might be a homage to the Revolverator, its function isn't anything like how that weapon is described, and it essentially just becomes a rocket launcher. But shit. Anything else? Yeah, I like the Lightning Strike. Despite it just kind of being a rifle that occasionally stuns, it's still fun to use. And the Cold Snap, the Bombardier, and Mr. Fungi, I don't really use that much. The Cold Snap is only really useful if you want to down bosses in 5 seconds, and I'm not really the biggest fan of set and forget weapons, but they are newish and fun weapon types to use. Oh, and they've made the chain gun a normal weapon type, and it's one of my favorites. Usually the chain gun is the Rhino, like the Rhino 2 and all the Rhinos past 4, excluding the fucking power armor. But in this game, the Black Hole Storm is our minigun-like weapon that fires very rapidly and can only be used for a small amount of time before it overheats, and the barrel can be spun up with a light pull of the trigger. There's some very mild strategy to using it. It's great, you can't just hold down the trigger and pray, and it has a shorter range to complement its relatively low time to kill. It's really fun to use. I just wish the Phantom Dash didn't cancel the spin up. It can make it a little annoying to use, especially in boss fights. But if the Rhino isn't a chain gun, what is it? Enough said. No, okay. The Rhino 8 is a cool new concept. It's more of an area of effect weapon, like the Rhinocerator or the Zodiac, except not trash. It's also visually congruent with the rest of the game, with, you know, portals and rifts and shit. You look at this and go, yeah, that makes sense. I also, perhaps controversially so, like that it doesn't make bosses a total cakewalk, because it barely damages them with the splash damage. Given that you can, and I did, get it before you even enter challenge mode, it would be a shame if you could make the final boss a pushover on your first playthrough, so it's nice that that can't happen. But I can see this being a point of contention for some. Personally, I don't mind, but I definitely would understand the sentiment of it being an overpowered weapon, so it should be overpowered on the bosses. I think that's everything, right? I'm not missing anything, am I? Well, if I did miss anything, and I'm pretty sure I didn't, I forgot to mention it out of spite, because it kept fucking overriding my quick select wheel, and it also comes from a shit game. But with my hastily and sloppily listing of every weapon in the game and some minor details about them complete, I'm done with the good stuff about the weapons, because now it's time for the less good stuff. I hate to say it, but I ain't a fan of the Raritanium upgrades. I never have been. That's right, yeah, crack a time superiority, and it's because it tends to make weapon upgrades feel a lot less meaningful. Upgrading a weapon should be exciting. It's why my favorite weapon leveling system is from Going Commando. Yeah, wrap your head around that one. I have issues with the 5-tier leveling system from Up Your Arsenal. In fact, Deadlock's the only game to ever get it right. Yeah, Gladiator superiority, and that's funny, given the similarities between the Raritanium upgrades and Deadlock's alpha mods. I could probably do a whole video on the upgrade systems of these games, but suffice it to say that the Raritanium upgrades don't feel like adding fun new abilities to your weapons. It just feels like busy work, especially as the game goes on and you have to scroll through like 10 different weapons upgrade trees. I'm just glad that there's a buy all, so during challenge mode, once you've farmed 500 Raritanium, you can max out everything really easily. There's no way we're going back to the single leveling of Going Commando, which, by the way, if you wanted some more reasons I prefer it, it makes every weapon level up feel unique because it changes the functionality of the weapon, and failing that, the name and the color of the quick select icon. And it's also less heavy at incentivizing you to use not already upgraded weapons, which Isn't that the whole point of upgrading your weapons, so you have more powerful weapons to use? But even within the 5-tier leveling system, surely there's a better way of having upgrades. Maybe bring back the Constructo mods, that was a dope system that never got used again. Or maybe have each tier add additional features to the weapons, like the ones that you buy with Raritanium. Or maybe, I don't know, just have each level actually change the weapons in any way that isn't just unlocking stuff on the Raritanium tree. Because the weapon levels, aside from the final one, pretty much don't mean anything. They barely increase damage, they don't increase ammo because Raritanium does that, and they don't add any additional functionality. So the most substantial thing about the weapon levels is that it gives you a free refill. Come on guys, you've made this work before. Why are you just complacently using the upgrade system from 14 years ago and decidedly the worst one that you've ever made? Not cool. I played this game a total of 3 separate times for this video, and you know, also for myself. On my first playthrough, I played at the normal difficulty. On my challenge mode playthrough, I put it up to a high difficulty, and then I did another standard playthrough at the game's maximum difficulty. And I'm not really sure which one I prefer, because the standard difficulty was way too easy for me, and sure, the higher up I put, the more difficult it got, but I don't really think it got any more challenging. It just kind of pronounced the bits of design that aren't that great, the stuff that kind of gets swept under the rug when taking damage isn't as impactful, and the time to kill isn't that high. Like these bosses, at the normal difficulty they were fucking easy, and it was only during my challenge mode playthrough at the higher difficulty that I discovered that their energy beam attack fires out no matter whether you can see them or not, and can snipe you from across the fucking map through walls. Any 3 of those aren't the worst design in the world, but all 3 of them combined with other enemies, particularly large groups of them, is just shit. The fight doesn't become a test of your skill, of your ability to read the enemies in the arena, because there's so much visual stimulation all at once it's impossible to pass. It's why when they're alone the fight is fine, but when you have a bunch of enemies as well, it's just a test of how quickly you can dump your arsenal into them, so they don't 360 wallbang you as you try and deal with the rest of the fucking enemies. And the hardest difficulty just exacerbated that even more. I think it was as difficult as the final difficulty should be for this game as it is, but again, it's not actually challenging, and even more stuff sticks out, like how these red and orange enemies blend into their red and orange backgrounds, making them really difficult to see. It also makes that movement I was just raving about less useful, because the way enemies get more aggressive means that your ability to play around with your movement is lessened, which is a shame. I'd have loved to see the difficult combat require more use of your movement options, not less. Going back to the general concept of this game's difficulty, some of it stems, rather unfortunately so, from the amount of shit that could happen on the screen at any time. The Black Hole Vortex, the upgraded Black Hole Storm, is one of my favourite weapons, but its effect is just a liability at any kind of range that the weapon itself is actually useful, because the effect covers most of the screen that the combat is actually happening in. Difficulty from obstruction of vision isn't challenging, it's annoying, and luckily for the game, the times that this becomes bad are not as often as me ranting about it would seem. It's mainly in small bits of design, specific enemies, specific encounters, rather than a problem with the difficulty balancing of the combat overall. And at lower difficulties it becomes less and less of an issue. And that's not to say that this game is, on the whole, that difficult. It's not. More so that I wish that the challenge that was here was better considered to allow for more playful gameplay, rather than making it more frustrating. If they did, they could probably make the game deadlocked exterminator levels of difficult, but as it stands, that would just serve to make the game more annoying, rather than more challenging. Sure, the game doesn't offer an interesting challenge. However, what it does offer is some seriously fun to mess around with movement mechanics that make combat in traversal like much more interesting than the circle strafing the series had kinda turned into, alongside an almost great selection of weapons to unload into your enemies' craniums. I wasn't sure if Ratchet could offer new and interesting combat and traversal mechanics, but Insomniac has shown that they absolutely can. The real question, and the one I was far more skeptical on, is whether or not they could do the same with the narrative. To be honest, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect from the narrative of this game. Would it be a return to the sometimes well-written and impactful, but often incongruous stories of the likes of the Future Trilogy, or to the more playful, less serious, but tight scripts of the likes of the original quadrilogy? Well, it turns out it was neither. It's more of a mix between the writing of 2016 and the tone and character work of A Crack in Time. What this results in is a story with some actually pretty decent ideas, some kind of shit dialogue, excellent cutscene direction, and not the greatest pacing. To anyone hoping we'd get the Ratchet & Clank characterized as they were before the turn of the 2010s, you're gonna be disappointed. Their dynamic effectively boils down to, oh, they love each other because they're such good friends, how cute. It's not exactly the most compelling stuff around, and it mainly gets shown as them going, oh, haven't we done so much together? Right, Insomniac, just go have a look at Into the Nexus, take some notes, and then report back, alright? That's how you make characters feel like close friends without making them feel sappy and boring. Another minor thing, they are way too scared of things that, quite honestly, should be a walk in the park compared to the shit that they've seen. Clank going, yo, holy shit, he did during the undead Grantha fight. Like, I enjoyed it, but really they shouldn't be scared of this. Them, of all people, should not be seeing this and being afraid. Not the same Clank that literally watched Ratchet die. But seriously, what have they done to Clank? I'm still Clank. You know, shit, you're still Clank. At no point did you ever express any kind of emotion that you are less capable or changed or in any way different. Man, let me talk about something good before the fuckery of Clank really starts to piss me off. Oh yeah, I actually kind of like it when they reunite and they fly towards Odolus. Sure, it's ruined a bit by their dialogue, it's way too short and their song choice is overused, about as nuanced as a cheese grater, and kind of misses the point of the song entirely, but you know, I don't care, I enjoyed it. It's nowhere close to the moment they share in A Crack in Time, but you know, I'll give the game a win. What I had higher hopes for and was a little let down by was Rivet. In short, she's too nice. She's a little sassy, sure, and that's some of her better stuff, but for the most part, she's too nice, and more specifically, too much like Ratchet. I really would have liked to have seen not only how the visual design of the main Lombax changed, but also how their character changed. And given their vastly different histories, we could have seen some excellent contrast. Like, the Rivet in this game says that she doesn't work well with people, but at no point do I believe that that's actually true, because there's never any point where she can't or won't. And by making her a little bit more detached and dejected, maybe forcing her into working with Clank rather than her doing it of her own free will, would have made that point come across a lot better. I'll get into Kit later, and for the others, well, Nefarious is Nefarious. Sure, he's a little funny, but not funny enough for me to think that really there should be someone else there. But there is someone else there, you might say, and well, you're right, Infinite Nefarious is there, but he's basically just British Nefarious that's slightly more put together. He comes in too late to have any kind of impact. There is one cutscene he has with Dr. Nefarious that means anything at all, and then he's just kind of there for the rest of the game. The only other thing I really wanted to mention is the Zircons. Can they just fucking die already? Mr. Zircon, I don't really have many problems with because he barely even exists, and Mrs. Zircon, she's fine. This part here is extra cringe, but after that she's mostly harmless. It's Zircon Jr. that really gets my blood boiling. Does anyone in Insomniac, anyone on this fucking planet think that he is in any way funny or endearing or not just fucking obnoxious? Every fucking battle arena I want to stab myself in the ear holes because of this fucker, and to whoever wrote these lines and recorded this voice and mixed them into the game, I will fly across the Pacific to personally force you to listen to his lines on repeat so you can experience the auditory waterboarding that you have inflicted on every single person who plays this godforsaken game. To drag back the hyperbole a bit, I mean, it's not like the rest of the dialogue is any better. It's probably the worst part of this game's narrative. The way characters interacted with each other has absolutely no bite. Jokes are usually fine, but I have a feeling that's because they have to be well written to get them past the ratings board. Anything that's used to convey character is just bland and boring. Ratchet, and especially Clank, get the short end of the stick in this regard. I've mentioned it before, but man did they fuck Clank in this game. He's so divorced from what he was before that it's difficult to look at him and go, yeah, that's definitely the same person. Is that a reference to 2016? Shame on you. Just, anytime characters open their mouths in this game, there's a 50-50 chance of it being either passable or just bad. And that's our title characters who are usually bad in that regard. And the cutscenes, they're fine. Mainly just kind of cringe in places. Like, I'll get into the actual story details later, but the way it's told from a writing perspective can come off as very heavy-handed. And it's one of the reasons that the game can come across as being for children and only children, because there is absolutely no subtlety in this writing, which kind of makes you feel like the writers don't trust you to be able to understand subtext, you know, like children. As Donkey so eloquently put before I could, E for everyone means E for everyone, not just E for 5-year-olds. Like, A Crack in Time is by no means perfect, but I still enjoy some of its character work today, and I also did as a child. Like, did I fully understand the concepts of building a family rather than being given it, or letting go of past mistakes to not damage the future? No, of fucking course not even close. But that didn't hinder my enjoyment of it in any way. You don't have to compromise the delivery of your characters in order to make them understandable to children, because that doesn't actually make them more understandable to children, it just makes them come across as overly apologetic loaves of bread. And why is it that some of the best character writing the series has ever had was before they even had writers? I can think of so many cutscenes, admittedly not just in the original trilogy, also in the future series, that put this dialogue to shame.
It says, in case of emergency, break glass with wrench. Hold on. This one says, use rock to break glass to get wrench to break glass to get rock. Ooh, I love logic puzzles. Let's see. If you break the glass with the...
Solved it.
This is not only funny, but it's also an excellent example of character writing because it shows us who they are through their actions rather than them just saying it. And there's so many more like it. The ending to A Crack in Time, the intro to Into the Nexus, fuck anything from Deadlocked. It all makes this writing feel amateur. Luckily, I can't say the same about the cutscenes. This game's cutscenes, for the most part, are actually excellently directed, paced really well, and choreographed and shot with some real oomph, both for serious and comedic bits, regardless of whether or not I enjoy the content of those bits themselves. Coming from 2016, it's nice that they feel, you know, actually directed, and, you know, they kept my goldfish ass attention, so they must be doing something right. There is some pretty good cinematography in there, not just for a game, it's just decent stuff all around. I'm not going to go into full filmmaking analysis on them, because that would require more effort than me just saying they look good. Suffice it to say, when they aren't doing generic shot reverse, which there's nothing wrong with that to be clear, there is some interesting stuff going on here. A match cut here, an interesting angled veer. Sure, it's not groundbreaking, but I don't really think it needs to be. What's extra great is how seamlessly they transition into and out of gameplay. It isn't just a nice thing to show off the fact that these are rendered in the engine, it actually makes the cutscenes feel more connected to the character that you actually control, rather than them being two separate entities, which game cutscenes very often come across as. Like, just have a look at how this cutscene with alternate skid transitions back into the gameplay. It uses Ratchet's leading action in the last shot going into the gameplay, and it also has a slight push out of the camera. Makes this shot feel like it's part of the cutscene, even though it's actually part of the gameplay, and so it meshes the two together. Makes me not think of this Ratchet and this Ratchet as being separate, even though realistically one is Ratchet and the other is my dumbass. But who is Ratchet in this game? What does he add to the emotional tapestry that is this game's character arcs and theming? Well, spoiler alert, not that much, but regardless, let's have a look. This game starts on an entirely competent note, with Clank rebuilding the Dimensionator for Ratchet because he feels like he should have a chance to see his family. And Ratchet's like, yeah, we already resolved this plot point 3 times already, I'm good. And that's how it seems, at first, the game is going. And I didn't mind it that much. Sure, it leaves Ratchet without an arc, and Clank's ability to read people seems to have just up and fucking left since we last saw him, but it was something, and we haven't even met the third character yet, which could lead to some interesting dynamics. The unfortunate thing is, though, that it turns out Clank was right all along, and it's Ratchet who has the character arc, because according to this game, the conclusions to the Tools of Destruction, A Crack in Time, and Into the Nexus were just wrong, and he should go and find the Lombaxes, because the reason he didn't was apparently a character flaw, not character growth. And yes, I get the reason he never has in these games is because it was dangerous. He couldn't leave Tachyon there, the Great Clock would have exploded the universe, and the Dimensionator was fucked by the end of the Nexus. But like, the Dimensionator was just sitting there between Tools and Nexus. He could have fucked off to the Lombax dimension anytime he liked. And apparently the reason he never did was because he was afraid of not being good enough for them, not because he realized he didn't need to. Slight tangent, but I've always found the Lombaxes as described in the future series to be way more selfish than they were probably intended to be. Like, they were the ones who created Tachyon, and then they just left him to ravage the galaxy. They didn't leave because of the Kragmites, they left specifically because of Tachyon. It's supposed to be a tragedy that they left, but I've always read it as abandonment, like they just fucked off and dumped Ratchet and Angela and Azimuth off to a bunch of deserted shitholes because they couldn't be fucked to fix their own mistakes. It's probably why I don't like the idea of Ratchet needing to find them. Regardless, in theory, I actually quite like the idea of Ratchet dealing with self-doubt. I think it's an interesting one, but I think the execution, where these emotions stem from, could use some work. Because really, I think the Lombaxes being the root of this issue is what makes this idea seem a bit weird. It makes it come across as that he thinks that because the stuff he's done isn't comparable to an entire species, that he won't be good enough for them, despite the fact that the stuff he's done is comparable to an entire species, including things they never even accomplished. And I get it, it's supposed to be a character flaw, it's not supposed to be logical, but it doesn't really read to me as him actually underestimating his own self-worth. Trust me, I know what that's like. And more like he's just stupid, especially when he just blurts it outright. This was slightly more subtly written, it could be better, but I actually think there's a better character to be the root of this arc. Rivet. What if instead of being afraid that he isn't good enough to join the Lombaxes, he was afraid that he wasn't good enough to be a hero anymore? This line here at the start isn't just a joke, it's the start of his arc. He's weighed down by feeling that in his peaceful life after Nexus, he's lost all the skill that he had. It would make this celebration more thematically poignant, as he doesn't believe it should be thrown, not just because he's humble, but also because he thinks the person they are celebrating isn't him anymore. And Rivet could be the perfect conduit for this, as well for the past 8 years Ratchet has been, I don't know, probably fucking Telwyn. She's been the hero that he was in the 2000s. A perfect example, in his mind, of exactly what he should be, but isn't anymore. Maybe his actions could be smaller in scale than Clank and Rivet, and that could lead him to think that he isn't as capable as Rivet, and Kit could serve the same role as she does in the story to Ratchet now, except maybe less in the whole "you're cool, be happy now" kind of way, and more just by him realizing that her line of thinking, which is now much similar to his, is fucking stupid. You know, actual subtle character writing. Speaking of Rivet and Kit, I also quite like their arcs, in theory. Rivet is about learning to trust, and Kit's is about learning to let people trust her. There could be some nice contrast in there, and that's where pacing becomes an issue. Rivet's character, in terms of her distrust of robots, is more V-shaped than the frequency response of a pair of skull candy crushes. It starts pretty strong with her distrust of Clank, but then it immediately dissipates when she learns he's telling the truth, and never comes back again until she learns that Kit blew off her fucking arm. There isn't really much growth here. She just kind of is one way and then isn't and then is again and then isn't again, and I think that kind of stems back to her overly nice characterization. Being super distrusting could make her seem like a bit of a dickhead, and I think her arc suffers as a result. They were almost there when she just about tells Kit to go fuck herself, and I don't think Ratchet should have cut off her line here. Like, seriously, he doesn't even know what she's about to say. What the fuck? But I think they were a little fearful of making her an unlikable character. I don't think that's an unreasonable fear. I don't think she should be an unlikable, distrusting fuckhead either, but leaning into that just a little bit, especially at the start, would have been nice. Would have added to the narrative in a positive way, I think. The more I've thought about it, Kit seems to have the best arc out of all of these characters. It's well paced, it stems from realistic character flaws, and I think she acts as a much better contrast to Clank than Rivet does to Ratchet. They were both warbots designed for destruction that had changes of heart, but where Clank came out as kind-hearted and somewhat naive, she had to learn that after presumably killing a bunch of people, which leaves her incredibly distrusting of herself, to the point where she doesn't even want people to give her nicknames because she doesn't even think she can maintain even that level of attachment. And her history with Rivet is interesting, if not exactly the most compellingly told, but it actually leads to, you know, something interesting. There's some dramatic irony on Rivet's end, and there's also the, oh shit, she's the one that pew-pewed my arm off. Well, fuck, I guess I gotta go save everyone now. It's not a lot, but it's more than Clank and Ratchet get by a country mile, so you know, props to that. But it ain't perfect, not even close. She does do the thing of, haha, I'm gonna fuck off near the end of the game and you totally won't expect it when I arrive during the finale to save the day. Like, that shit worked for Quark up your arsenal because he was such a massive shithead that was actually surprising. Side note, is this really what we're gonna take away from Quark's character? Are you sure? It seems kind of, you know, factually incorrect, but whatever. But even the dumbest of children could see this kid shit coming from a mile away. Maybe I'm giving the dumbest of children too much credit. Regardless, it's still cliche and not a great note to end an otherwise respectable, if a bit poorly told, character arc on. You know, it makes it feel a little rushed, like she did her final development off screen. It's also a shame that I'm not a fan of her voice direction, not her vocal performance to be clear. I think the voice actor is doing a good job. I just don't think I would have directed this performance to be this robotic. Like, I get it, she's a robot, but robots in this universe often just talk like people, and all of the nefarious bots do, so why doesn't she? She has too many emotional beats, in my opinion, that get a little flattened by this direction for her voice. Also an aside, what the fuck is up with some of Clank's lines? He's got a similar thing going on here, where he's kind of more robotic than he has been before, but then we get shit like this.
Perhaps a symptom of the Dimensionator's destruction.
Clank is many things, but one thing he is most certainly not is the fucking G-Man. I can't be the only one who hears this right. Like, why does it sound like Clank's about to tell Rivet that the right man in the wrong place makes all the difference in the world? It's not even just this line. Granted, it's not many. Hell, I'd call it a tiny amount, but who saw this? Who heard this and was like, yeah, that sounds good. Ship it. Sorry, I'm gonna stop talking about minor details, important minor details, but minor details nonetheless, and I'll finish up talking about the game's narrative. There's some great stuff in the narrative of this game. I've been really harsh on it, and that is because I believe it needs to be improved, but also because I can see something good in there. It's buried under layers of bad decisions, holdovers from previous games, and that's why when it doesn't focus on them, it's the best part of the narrative. I don't like the fact that Rivet and Kit are the more compelling characters compared to Clank and Ratchet, but I don't believe that's because the writers think that they should be. It's more so when they're writing new characters, they don't have past baggage that they have to fight with. Not to say that these guys can't be interesting or compelling. I think I've demonstrated that I believe that the foundation for making them interesting characters exists in this game. It's just not utilized. And I definitely have problems with the writing of the other two as well. There's something good in there. It's not enough for me to say that the narrative is good. It's more passable. And that on its own would be fine, but the fact that it could have been so much better is what makes it truly disappointing. Right, so Rift Apart, huh? It's something, alright. Some of it is the best we've seen in the series. Some of it could use some work, and yeah, some of it needs to be gutted, but really, I don't see the bad stuff holding down the game by as much as you'd probably think. After Ratchet 2016, I was left dejected. It was a game that felt lifeless. It had a strong base of mechanics honed from 14 years of development, but it failed to do anything beyond them in any aspect. As a result, it was a commercialized mess, an ironic failure to heed the messages of the games that preceded it. Rift Apart is the opposite of lifeless. Sure, in some areas it needs work, but what's most important is that it is something new and exciting. I can only wish that they take the game design from this game, the much larger focus on mobility than I would have ever expected, and refine the stuff that didn't work, the narrative, the puzzle design, etc., and turn it into something truly incredible. My favorite game is a sequel from this very series, a game that took the core of its predecessor and transformed it into a game that, quite frankly, defined my childhood. Now, I don't know if Insomniac plans on following Rift Apart up, but if they do, they could quite possibly make the best game the series has ever seen. It's almost there, it's just being held back by past mistakes. Is that wishful thinking? Quite possibly. Maybe I'm giving Insomniac way too much credit because Rift Apart wasn't a trash fire. Or maybe I'm being too hard on it because it wasn't as good as my nostalgic memories of the originals. I can't be sure. But for now, I'm just glad that my boys are out of the pit they've been stuck in for 12 years. Rift Apart isn't exactly what I expected, nor is it quite fully what I wanted. But it's done something I really needed this series to do. It gave me hope. The ball's in your court now, Insomniac. Make it count.
No matter how they toss the dice, it had to be. The only one for me is you, and you for me. So happy
together. If you've gotten this far into the video, I'd just like to take the time to say thank you. I mean, it's kind of a long video, and the fact that you've watched all the way to this, or, you know, even if you just skipped to the end, whatever, who cares? It's, you know, it means a lot. And I just have a couple things to say. You're gonna learn very quickly why I script my videos, because this is gonna be a fucking mess. But, yeah, this has been like a pretty big production on my end. It's probably the biggest thing I've ever worked on. It's not even that much, but just, you know, my standards are fucking low. But, so it's just, you know, it's just nice that the two people who have made it this far into this probably 40-minute video, I haven't even finished editing it yet, but I think it's probably going to be around 30 to 40 minutes from my rough estimations. Yeah, so that's just thanks. Also, I'm gonna stop talking about Ratchet & Clank for a bit. Not entirely. I have some video ideas that I'm currently thinking about, but I just need to talk about some other games for a bit. It's been great seeing the growth from those videos, but I do need to just kind of put it aside and stop playing these fucking games for a little bit. I do have some other video concepts for other games, so it's not like I'm gonna take another fucking 2 months. I'm gonna stop recording now because I've been recording for like 15 minutes and none of it is usable, so outro.